What if the prayers you whisper in your darkest hour were not just words floating into the silence, but keys that could unlock doors of grace already waiting to be opened? Imagine standing in the quiet of a hospital hallway or at your child's bedside, clutching your rosary as though it were a lifeline. You pray with tears in your voice, yet heaven seems unmoved. Could it be that the problem isn't your faith, but something far simpler, like dialing the right number to reach the one you love? In urgent moments, more than 90% of Catholics instinctively turn to the Hail Mary. It rises from our hearts almost without thought, like breath. But few realize that heaven desires not only our devotion, but also a certain precision. And this is not folklore or superstition, it's a truth preserved through the Church, whispered by saints, and safeguarded by mystics. Father Dan Rehill, a Catholic priest and exorcist seasoned by decades of pastoral ministry, uncovered this pattern again and again. He noticed that the faithful would pour out their hearts, yet still leave confession feeling unseen, unheard. They weren't lazy in prayer, they loved God. They went to Mass. They prayed the rosary with devotion.
God bless you and bring you
But the
peace.
silence weighed heavy. That's when Father Dan began to see. It wasn't a lack of belief, but a lack of formation. No one had ever told them that certain prayers are shaped for certain hours of trial. Heaven, like a physician who knows the exact dose required for healing, sometimes waits for us to match our cry with the right measure of prayer. Many were offering their pain, but not the fullness of what heaven invited. And so, the silence lingered not because God had turned his face away, but because heaven was waiting for alignment. This realization crystallized one afternoon outside the ICU. A young mother, her hands trembling around a rosary, paced the corridor with eyes swollen from crying. Her child was in surgery, the doctors grim. When Father Dan approached, she whispered through her tears, "I've prayed all day, every hour, but nothing changes. What else can I do?" Father Dan didn't tell her to simply believe harder. Instead, he asked a question that seemed to cut through the fog. "Have you ever prayed with heaven's precision?" At first, she looked puzzled. Then, gently, he explained what he had once learned from a holy old priest. In urgent moments, Mary responds to a very specific number of Hail Marys. Not as magic, not as a formula, but as a response to a sacred invitation. He gave her the number. He showed her how to pray it 3 times a day, for 9 days, uniting faith with structure, trust with rhythm. She left that chapel no longer clutching just a rosary, but a blueprint for supernatural intercession. And slowly, the silence began to break. From the very beginning, every Marian apparition has carried this thread of precision. At Lourdes, Our Lady gave clear instructions. At Fatima, she named the daily rosary, the first Saturdays, consecration to her Immaculate Heart. At Guadalupe, she asked for a church built in a specific place. Again and again, Mary speaks with exactness, never vaguely. Why? Because heaven itself moves in divine order, and Mary, the perfect disciple, reflects that order in everything she asks. As Father Dan often reminds the faithful, Mary's requests are not mere suggestions. They are sacred invitations, an invitation to step into the rhythm of grace, where prayer is no longer scattered words, but a melody in tune with heaven itself. And this is where our journey continues, into the sacred number that saints trusted and demons fear. Heaven's order is never random, it always carries a rhythm, a purpose. In the last part, we saw how Mary's requests were never vague but exact, precise, like stepping stones across a river. That same divine precision continues to echo through the Church, not shouted in headlines, but whispered from saint to mystic, from priest to priest, waiting for those willing to listen. And here is the mystery. God has always worked with numbers, not as cold calculations, but as signs of his eternal logic. The flood that purified the earth lasted 40 days. The Israelites wandered for 40 years, learning to depend on God alone. Jesus fasted 40 days before confronting the devil in the desert. And when Peter asked about forgiveness, Christ answered with 70 times 7, a number that stretches to infinity, yet still remains precise. Nothing in heaven is accidental. Every detail is chosen. Every number matters. Mary, the perfect disciple, mirrors this same order. When she speaks, her words carry weight because they reflect heaven's will, and when she makes a request, it is never careless. Father Dan Rehill often reminds us, just as the physical world has laws, gravity, seasons, cycles, the spiritual world follows its own divine laws. Some prayers carry particular weight, not because they twist God's arm, but because they flow with heaven's design. The saints understood this. They didn't simply pray a lot. They prayed with intention, with timing, with pattern. They prayed in step with the heartbeat of God. And Mary responds most powerfully when her children mirror the same clarity she herself showed in Nazareth, when she said, "Let it be done to me according to your word," that yes aligned earth with heaven. And your yes can too. When Father Dan first whispered the number to that grieving mother outside the ICU, she stopped in confusion. "Why 153?" she asked, her voice breaking. Father Dan opened the Gospel of John, chapter 21. The disciples, weary after a night of empty nets, obeyed Jesus' command to cast again. And suddenly, the net strained under the weight of 153 large fish. Not 150, not 200, exactly 153. The early church fathers, St. Jerome, St. Augustine, pondered this mystery and concluded that the number symbolized the fullness of grace, the completeness of God's provision. Heaven had marked it with meaning. Father Dan explained that just as the apostles pulled up exactly 153 fish in obedience, so too the faithful are invited to cast their nets into prayer with the same number, trusting Mary's intercession. When someone prays 153 Hail Marys with faith, especially over 9 days of deep urgency, they step into a biblical rhythm. It isn't superstition, it isn't magic. It is obedience to a divine pattern, one heaven has honored before and still honors now, and those who embrace it often see what others call impossible. But there is more. Those who experience this grace didn't just pray 153 Hail Marys in one breathless rush, they prayed with structure. Over 9 days, they broke the prayers into 3 sets of 51, morning, midday, evening, 51, 51, 51. Why 51? Because according to the Church, there are 51 officially recognized Marian apparitions. Each set becomes a way of invoking her presence throughout the day, at dawn, at noon, at dusk, offering every hour of need into her hands. And notice how each time of day mirrors a Marian mystery. In the morning, the Annunciation, when she said yes without delay. At midday, the Visitation, when she hurried to serve Elizabeth. In the evening, Cana's wedding feast, where her intercession moved Jesus to work his first miracle. This is not about endless repetition, it is about alignment, a sacred pattern that transforms scattered words into a vessel of grace. It may require discipline, it may stretch your focus, but when carried out, this prayer becomes like a net, lowered into the deep, pulled back, not with fish, but with grace in abundance. And this leads us to the next step, how this practice, repeated with faith, has brought breakthrough after breakthrough for those who dared to trust Mary's invitation. Those who dare to commit to these 9 days often echo the same words at the end. Something shifted. Heaven felt near. Mary was with me. Father Dan Rehill has heard this again and again. And yet, nothing prepared him for what happened after that grieving mother left the ICU chapel, clutching her rosary like a lifeline. She returned days later, but this time, her eyes were filled not with sorrow, but with joy. On the 5th day of her novena, doctors noticed something unusual. The scans that once painted a bleak future now revealed unexpected improvement. By the 9th day, her son, who had hovered between life and death, was discharged from the hospital. The doctors had no explanation. She did. Through tears, she whispered, "Mary did this." But hers was not the only story. A local business owner in Father Dan's parish faced financial collapse. bankruptcy looming like a storm. He had exhausted every option, every prayer he knew. In desperation, he turned to the 9-day novena of 153 Hail Marys. He prayed with tears, pouring out his fear and uncertainty. On the 8th day, the phone rang. A long-lost client reappeared, signing a contract large enough not just to rescue his business, but to expand it. What he thought was the end became a new beginning. Then came the wife, who carried a heavier burden her husband's hardened heart. For years, he mocked her faith, dismissing her devotion to God. Quietly, without his knowledge, she began the novena. Each bead, each prayer, was offered for his conversion. On the 9th day, something broke. Without warning, he asked to meet with Father Dan. 2 weeks later, the man who once mocked baptism stepped into the waters himself. Father Dan has seen enough to know this novena is not superstition. It is spiritual precision, and it invites miracles, not always the same kind, but always grace. Sometimes healing, sometimes provision, sometimes conversion. The form may differ, but the fruit is undeniable. So why, if this prayer is so powerful, have so few Catholics heard of it? Father Dan believes the answer is simple and sobering, because the enemy of souls works tirelessly to keep it hidden. Satan does not tremble at vague prayers. He trembles at precision. He fears obedience. He recoils when a soul dares to align itself with heaven's design and calls on Mary with unwavering trust. Throughout history, devotion to Our Lady has faced the fiercest opposition, and that's no accident, because wherever Mary steps in, the devil must step back. The novena of 153 Hail Marys is not just comfort, it is combat, spiritual artillery, a prayer that doesn't merely console the suffering heart, but strikes terror into the enemy's camp. And that's why so many never hear of it, or dismiss it as excessive, or forget about it before they begin. Because if the faithful embraced this practice widely and faithfully, hell would lose ground every single day. As Father Dan often says, the devil's greatest trick isn't denying God's power. It's distracting you from the ways God pours it out. And if you're hearing this now, it is not by accident. Heaven is inviting you. Mary is not looking for vague devotion, but for willing obedience. Too many Catholics believe love alone is enough in prayer, but Father Dan has learned, through decades of ministry, that Mary desires not only our affection, but our alignment. Why? Because she herself lived in perfect alignment with God's will. From the Annunciation to the cross, Mary never acted carelessly. She responded with precision, "Let it be done to me according to your word," Luke 1:38. The Catechism calls her both the model of faith and charity, CCC 967, and mediatrix of all graces, CCC 969. These titles are not passive, they mean she actively channels God's grace, but always through the precise channels heaven has designed. Street. Louis de Montfort wrote that Marian devotion carries great power, but its deepest fruit comes when united with her instructions. The saints never approached Mary casually. They followed her requests down to the numbers, the timing, the form. So when Mary reveals a number, it is not superstition, it is invitation. And obedience to that invitation is what opens the floodgates of heaven. Father Dan has seen it time and again. A soul hesitates, delays, whispers, "I'll start tomorrow." But tomorrow becomes next week, and next week becomes never. And here is the sobering truth. Moments of grace can slip by. Urgent needs don't pause. The enemy certainly doesn't. But heaven, in its mystery, often waits for your response, waits for your yes. The novena of 153 Hail Marys is not just a string of words, it is a declaration, a signal rising to heaven that says, "I am serious, I am surrendered, I trust you, Mother." And for those who truly begin, something begins to shift. Perhaps not always in the way they expect, but always in ways that carry meaning. A diagnosis starts to change. A heart once closed begins to soften. A peace, subtle yet unmistakable, settles over a home. But nothing begins until you begin. Mary is ready to intercede, but she will never force herself into your battle. She waits to be invited clearly, intentionally, faithfully with the number heaven has revealed. If your heart is stirred even now, perhaps she is already knocking. Don't leave her standing outside the ICU of your life, waiting to be welcomed in. For Father Dan Rehill has seen what happens when Catholics say yes, not a vague, half-hearted yes, but a measured, humble, persistent yes. A yes prayed 153 times a day for 9 days. This novena is not only for miracles, it is for union. Union with the Mother, who sees what you cannot see, who knows which doors in heaven must open, and how. It is for those willing to step into rhythm with grace, to let their prayers become part of heaven's design. So if you feel the invitation, respond. Whisper in your heart, "Holy Mary, I begin today with you." Let even a simple comment become a prayer, not for attention, but for victory. If this message touched you, consider sharing it with someone who may be carrying a silent cross. If you desire to grow in wisdom the world rarely speaks of, subscribe and walk this path with us. And tonight, before you close your eyes, open your Bible to John 21:11. Read of the 153 fish, counted one by one, and let that number mark the beginning of your own novena of mercy. You are not abandoned. You are not forgotten. Mary is already on her way. May her mantle rest upon you. May her voice speak for you. And may heaven move in your life in ways so breathtaking, you will know without a doubt you were never alone.